I am really thrilled to be joined by a distinguished panel of folks who deal with these issues from the public side, dealing with not only how to think about particular industries, but how this sort of weaves into the fabric of the communities, and thinking about sort of really important issues as to equity, also thinking about sustainability, and thinking about the long term. So let me just start by sort of offering a little bit of perspective in terms of the way that I sort of came to this issue. I'm a public finance person. Don't really think about the built environment, although I do have a background in planning. And the way that we kind of came across this issue from Pew's perspective is looking at how autonomous vehicles, trends in e-commerce, demographics potentially further narrow the tax bases of state and local governments. Being at this conference and just looking up and looking at some of the issues that you're grappling with, it's alarming and striking just how many facets these particular sort of dynamics that we're focusing on over the last couple of days really sort of touches on so many aspects of like the land use policy, not only sort of tax policy, but also how particular services are delivered and how communities grow and thrive into the future. So one of the questions that I wanted to sort of kick off to all of my panelists is, you've heard a lot about the emerging sort of technological trends that are on our doorstep at the moment. If there was like one thing that you could sort of highlight that really concerns you and you really feel like you need to think about in the next 5 years, what would that be? You want to start with Leah?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for hanging out, and I hope you've had a wonderful time here in Portland. It was wonderful hosting you. For my perspective, running the transportation department for the city of Portland, we are primarily charged in this space with the regulatory framework. And I think that that's going to be the more challenging thing for us to figure out, because we want to incentivize and invite new technologies and new mobility solutions. And the government tends to be pretty heavy-handed in its regulatory approach, which disincentivizes innovation. So I think our ability to be nimble and be responsive and provide a level playing field for all the people who are interested in participating in this space for a shared outcome is what we need to be focusing a lot of attention on.
Mm-hmm. Martha?
Yeah, I'm Martha Bennett, and I am in my double role here, but the good news is I think the answer to this question, I get to do both. And I also want to do a shout out to my staff who stayed, so those of you who stayed to see me speak, I appreciate it very much. I actually think that the challenge of this moment is that our fundamental goals as public agencies actually don't change, right? So the things that we're trying to accomplish on behalf of our residents, whether that's a great community, great economy, transportation mobility, great environment, don't change. But a lot of the systems and structures underneath them that make it possible for us to move towards those goals are threatened by these changes. And our ability to react, I think the academic panel talked about this a little bit, our ability to react to what's happening, the change, in a way where we're setting up our systems and structures in a way that takes us where we want to go isn't super great. So our ability to be responsive in the moment isn't really great. And then last but not least, I actually don't think this is going to be nirvana or a Hunger Games dystopia. I think what this technology is going to do to our communities is accelerate whatever trends we're facing. So the good things are going to accelerate, the bad things are going to accelerate, like our equity concerns, like our rural-urban split. And so what we need to do is think both fast and slow, to borrow a term. We need to think about this as like the transition to cell phones, like the conversion from horse and buggy to cars, in that it's going to happen one step at a time, and we have to be doing systems thinking. So we've got to react quickly, but we also have to have the long view in mind at the same time.
Hi everyone, I'm Molly. I'm from NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials. And in true NACTO fashion, I would dive into the infrastructure piece of this and say that both the built environment and kind of the virtual infrastructure that cities need moving forward is imperative to achieving either the nirvana or the dystopia.
Neither one.
But to move forward. And so I think kind of the data and partnerships piece of this, but also our cities have been really adamant about better understanding freight and the curb and kind of this contest over the space and who manages and owns that space in the future.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Alex Pezhikanik. I'm the Assistant Director for Planning, Policy, and Permitting in the City of Pittsburgh's Department of Mobility and Infrastructure, which is a very long title for a very long last name. I think our challenge, or the biggest challenge, is kind of recognizing and appreciating the time gaps between where the future is headed and what we still have to deliver today. We are very intentionally a Department of Mobility and Infrastructure because there is both this need for preparation for and response to emerging technology. There are also critical hardscape infrastructure improvements and maintenance work that needs to be done in the interim. And so how we correctly kind of balance and build that calculation between what needs to be delivered today and how we preserve and maintain our existing infrastructure while slowly moving, or while quickly in some cases moving to that new future is a real critical gap for cities.
Mm-hmm. Let's stay with you, Alex. I mean, one of the things that you highlighted was this transition period that state and local governments have to confront, where they still have a set of key services that they need to deliver while at the same time thinking ahead about what's coming from a technological as well as sort of demographic perspective. I'm wondering, given that government tends to be a little bit more reactive than sort of prospective in its thinking. What are the things that cities like Pittsburgh and Portland are doing to prepare for some of the trends that they know that are around the corner or on the horizon rather, and the ones that they don't know about yet?
I think we actually issued an RFP with the Gretzky quote, "Skate where the puck is going," last year. I think our philosophy is about making sure that we've got the most flexibility and the most adaptability for as many potential futures as possible, making sure that the investments that we make are ones that can be easily repurposed and adapted, which has been an economic development strategy in Pittsburgh for a generation now, in terms of repurposing and reusing existing assets. I also think that the kind of key North Star that we have when it comes to preparation for emerging mobility is how it responds to resident needs and user needs and use cases. It seems like it's simple, but it's, I think, often forgotten that our job as a government is not to kind of perpetually exist in and of itself, right? It's to deliver services to present and future residents and taxpayers. And so it's important that as we consider these trends and as we prepare for them, the North Star, the guiding philosophy is how are our residents benefited from those services, and how can we enhance and make sure that equitable and accessible benefit is there to all.
Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, Lee, if you can jump in, because you had mentioned that one of the challenges the government has is sometimes it's a little heavy-handed in the way that it regulates particular industries. Cass Sunstein, when he was an advisor to President Obama, had really put forth this notion, at least at the federal level, of encouraging regulations to be more principle-based. What are the outcomes that we want to see? What are the objectives we want to achieve with the regulatory frameworks that we put in place? And I'm wondering how Portland has taken a step in that direction.
Sure, thanks. So we have in Portland, we are a well-known planning city. We have a ton of plans that already articulate our values and the outcomes that we really want to see through our transportation investments, housing investments, economic development. And the approach that we've taken in terms of autonomous vehicles is really trying to let the market solve the problems that we've articulated. So we put out an RFP almost a year ago, a request for expressions of interest, not an RFP, for an RFI. And we put it out there saying, in the city of Portland, we really want to welcome autonomous vehicles to our roads. However, they can't add to congestion. They have to work on our climate goals. They need to be equitable in serving our historically underserved communities and getting people to jobs as people are getting pushed out of the central city. And we really want them to be shared, right? So we were basically asking for nirvana from the private sector and really wanted to see what the private sector could give back to us. And I think it was really interesting, even though this RFI was just a year ago, the responses that we got were very minimal. We got the majority of the responses were from firms that wanted to do program management, political management work for us in the AV space, and only 1 or 2 proposals about actually launching AVs in the city. I feel like if we put out that RFI again today, we would have a vastly different response than what we got over a year ago. So, but we're taking the information that we have and we're moving forward, and we continue to focus on the outcomes that we want to achieve. We've set a value proposition of how we think AVs need to operate in the city, and we're going to keep plugging along on that path. And hopefully we have a mandate to get AVs on the road before the end of the year. So we're really hopeful that it's going to happen along the lines that we have articulated. And we do, like I'm sure every other city that's been here, we have lots of companies knocking down our doors wanting to launch in the city of Portland. And we've so far been able to hold very firm about what we want to see. And if I could just tack on one other thing, I think the thing that, in terms of regulation, that I have even greater concerns about is for the ability of local jurisdictions to maintain their regulatory authority in this space. We all know that the financial backers who are behind all of the AV companies, they're not even working at the state level anymore in terms of preemption. They've jumped straight to the feds. So we're really concerned that we won't be able to hold our autonomy in the autonomous space.
Mm-hmm. That's a great segue into the questions that I had next for Martha and Molly. As sort of representatives of associations that deal with jurisdictions across the United States, when you think of sophisticated companies that are in some cases multinational, but sort of national companies like Uber and Lyft, sitting across the table with like a small local jurisdiction, and there's like just an asymmetry there in terms of knowledge, power, and things of that nature. Like, what's the role that ICMA and this is like the worst nightmare when it's like I can't sort of exactly pronounce the acronym NACTO.
Yep.
Okay.
Good job.
So NACTO sort of provide their members. Like what are the things that you're sort of focusing on at the national level in terms of like engaging your membership in as they sort of think about interfacing with these companies?
You want to go first?
I will.
Yeah.
So I will say that our engagements between our cities and private companies happen at various different levels, and while we've been kind of simultaneously seeing this opening in I guess, willingness to cooperate and engage with cities, especially through NACTO, so that we can kind of bring together requests. But also, we are staring down this AV bill that I think Leah is referring to, that where preemption is not a bug but a feature. And so you have cities that are coming together and saying, this is a problem, we need to fix it.
Right.
And at the same time, there's no way to really, even as a national organization, take on the lobbying power of Ford, Uber, GM, and every other company that might be represented here. And so that's definitely something that we're trying to grapple with. That said, we've also, in the last couple of months, seen, like I said, a large opening in data sharing and what that means, and so kind of the incrementalism that could get us to a better agreement, but not if we get top-down preempted from the space.
If I could just jump in here before you answer, Martha,
Yeah,
what you see is so much sort of variability across the local jurisdictions, and that's a really sort of key feature. And from the city perspective, you want the autonomy to sort of shape your future in the distinct way that your communities need you to. But from a company perspective, what they're looking for is clear signals across the marketplace. Right. And so, how do you balance those things?
Well, so from an ICMA perspective, what ICMA does, right, is provide thought leadership to local government managers about what are the issues that they face and what are the resources that they have. They also do collaborate with other big organizations that lobby Congress and then also lobby at the state levels. I do think the variation in capacity is one of the big challenges that we as city leaders have. Some communities like Portland are well prepared. There's 24 cities in the Portland metropolitan area, and I could tell you probably 8 of them are prepared to have this conversation, and probably the other 16 are not even thinking about it because they're really worried about making sure that when you turn the tap, water comes out. So I think that the other things I think we have to do in the local level is realize too that the people who live in our communities, they don't only exist in our communities, they travel to other places. And so we do have an interest in making sure that some of the standards that exist in Portland are also present in Beaverton and Hillsborough and Gresham, so that the people who live in the entire region can go about their daily lives. And so I think we have to figure out where are the governance questions best dealt with. some questions like what kind of community do we want to be and how do we want to provide transportation to our residents really do belong at the local level. Other questions about some of this technology and how it's going to be deployed have to be made at either a regional or a state level to make sure that our systems actually are integrated and work well together.
Mm-hmm. So we've primarily focused the conversation, at least this morning, on the city level, so to the local jurisdiction. And while we're like kind of sticking it to the feds, I'm wondering like preemption is obviously something that's very problematic from a local government perspective, but I'm wondering, in your mind, what's the thing that the federal government should be doing to better support the decision-making of local governments, especially as they grapple with some of these trends that are that we've talked about today and the last 2 days? Leah, do you want to?
Oh, well, I work in a city and I operate in a city, so I understand that the companies are looking for some sort of uniformity because it helps they're a private company. They're looking for a bottom line. They have an ROI and they have, to make money. So the sort of equitable playing field in their mind is set standards. However, for the local jurisdiction, not only do we have these policy outcomes and value propositions that we really are heavily invested in, we also have a financial stake just as equal as the private companies. And so the feds need to recognize that, and preempting our ability to charge fees or to charge permits or to charge companies for using our infrastructure is something that needs to be seen from the federal government as well. And the way that the legislation or the way that the market seems to be going is none of that is being taken into account. And we're going to be taking our ability to adequately charge for the infrastructure that's being used and the demands that are being put on us is being diluted incredibly.
Mm-hmm. Martha?
If I could just add, though, I think the first thing they need to do is they need to actually consciously address transportation finance. We've got to go to congestion pricing. We've got to go to user-based fees. We've got to do that not just at the local or state level. We've got to do that nationally. The gas tax is a dinosaur, like both literally and figuratively. And so we need to get on it. And we have a lot of federal government laws and policies that restrict that being done at the national level, but also that being done at the state and local level. Those things need to be lifted. The other thing, if I may, as my ICMA hat is, the federal governments need to create some platforms to make sure that we don't worsen the urban-rural divide in our country. Just like rural electrification, we got to have universal access to this, and it can't just be allowing the companies that can make money in the inner part of our inner cities like Portland to just Angus is sitting over there. He said, take the cream off the top. We've got to make sure that we have universal access to these new technologies, and only the federal government can create that platform for our country.
Mm-hmm.
I also think there's a role in the federal government in capacity building for those smaller jurisdictions, and that's actually a really important role at the state level as well. Pennsylvania, we have somewhere around 3,000 municipalities, some as small as 200 or 300 residents. Those are organizations that just don't have the wherewithal. We barely have the time and the capacity to think about these issues. And so there's a role for those higher levels of government in providing technical assistance, providing support to those communities so that they can make their own decisions or their own recommendations on what policy is right in their jurisdictions.
And I'll just add, going back to dinosaurs, we have seen kind of as part of the federal AV bill, just a lot of either power taken away from cities or delegated to organizations that aren't necessarily staffed to take on the problems of the future or even the problems of the present. So better funding and resourcing organizations or entities like NHTSA and putting city representation on federal committees is just a small step in the right direction there.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I wanted to sort of shift to is how local governments can more effectively work with private sector companies. One of the things that we heard on previous panels was some of the friction that private companies experience when trying to engage local government officials, whether it's responding to an RFP or engaging in some sort of memorandum of understanding in order to pursue a common set of objectives. The representative from LIV talked about these mobility hubs, which I think sound like a very simple idea, but in order to make something like that happen, it will require an immense amount of public and private investment. And I'm wondering, from your perspectives, like what are some of the more effective ways you think the public sector, specifically local government, can engage their private sector counterparts and sort of achieve, not to sound corny, but a double bottom line?
So I'd take a stab at this. I think the first step and the most important step is to walk into any of those opportunities for partnership or relationship understanding that there are, in some places, converging interests and in other places, diverging interests. The idea that there's kind of full alignment between kind of any public-private partnership, even any procurement, is kind of a foolhardy way to enter into that relationship. That's not to say that there aren't opportunities for partnership and that there aren't areas of mutual concern. But if you kind of come in or enter in assuming that everything, that everybody's kind of speaking the same language and understands it from the same perspective, without kind of articulating that, you're going to be in for a bad time. So I think it's important to kind of align those, and I also think that's true in the procurement process. That's true in the partnership process. It's kind of across the board.
Yeah, sorry, Leah, if you want to.
No, go ahead.
I'll add to that just kind of a lesson learned in that regard. In January of last year, NACTO worked with our cities to come out with data sharing principles that included this wonderful list at the back of what the data that cities want shared could be. And it really was rooted in what New York mandates that TNCs share with them. And that was not an effective way to engage TNCs, but it was an effective way to start warming the waters toward better understanding what the outcomes that cities want from TNC service was. And we announced last week, or 2 weeks ago now, kind of a global data repository for all different kinds of street data called Shared Streets that we've been working really hard with our cities on. And we hope this is a step in the right direction toward better understanding what's happening on our streets, but also having that outcome-oriented and city-built, so you're not staring down terabytes of data that you can't actually use.
I think, recognizing and understanding and accepting is that it's okay that these companies want to make money, right? Right? Yep. And
It's actually good.
It's actually a good thing, and I think that government jurisdictions somehow reflexively recoil at that and start standing up regulatory frameworks in response. And it's okay that companies want to make money. We just need to continue to serve the public good, and trying to find the intersectionality between those two things is truly possible. So having a really open conversation, I think, with private companies as well. I think government always gets down to this, like, we need to put out an RFP, we have to follow the procurement rules, we have to do all these things, but understanding that you can have conversations beforehand and try to find out where you have some shared outcomes and shared values, and work closely with the private sector to articulate that in your public documents for moving forward. It's okay to do, and it's actually more beneficial for everyone involved when you start at the forefront with a really open, intentional relationship. We are going to be moving forward in this space. It's happening whether we want to or not, so we may as well just create a partnership and sit at the table together for our vested interests of the public values and outcomes, and for their bottom line.
Well, I guess we're trying something at Metro that's really pragmatic, which is we're starting a small grant program. So if we're seeing a type of technology that we want to see advanced, but we want it to be advanced in, say, a particular community of color, or we want to do it in a low-income neighborhood, let's offer an RFP or an RFQ for a small amount of grants to see if we can get a private company to pilot it. So I would say don't approach it as an adversarial relationship necessarily. Try to figure out if you can, and frankly, we'd be funding those programs anyway, right? So now we're just going to fund it through a new way. And so think about, can you innovate your systems at the same time as the private sector is innovating what's happening?
I think it's also helpful to bring in kind of those trusted brokers or other stakeholders that can kind of serve as the bridge, right? We do a lot of work, obviously, with Carnegie Mellon, the local chamber of commerce, the business improvement district downtown. There are these kind of organizations that have the ability to bridge between where private sector companies want to be and the goals and the interests of the public sector, and to the degree they can serve as the glue, it's really valuable.
So you had, Alex, sort of highlighted the value of thinking ahead and coming to the sort of table with an idea of what you wanted to get from the private sector companies that are trying to engage the city. In your experience, I don't know if you are able to sort of speak to this, but in thinking about the partnership Pittsburgh has with Uber, and this is not my question actually, so I can't take credit for this. I think Becky actually posed this, but I thought it was a good one, so I'm going to use it. What's the thing that you wish you had asked for from Uber that you didn't? And in retrospect, so going forward, like what are you going to ask for?
Just one, huh?
Yeah.
I think, and I will start by saying that I think today, right now, I've got a great working relationship with my colleagues at Uber. I think we've kind of found the areas of alignment, and we found the places around electrification of vehicles, around data for kind of specific applications. We've kind of found those opportunities of convergence. I think when we started, the thing that we didn't necessarily realize, and this is actually still, can still be a challenge, is we didn't understand the timeline, right? We didn't understand just how quick we were talking about the advancement of the technology and the advancement of deployment. And the blurring of that line between testing and operations is something that I think was kind of underappreciated on our end. We went from the vehicles kind of riding the roads for a few months to picking up passengers to then being in fare service in a matter of 6 months. And I don't know that we necessarily anticipated that or really had a clear understanding that was how fast the organization was planning on moving. And I still, I think that it's helpful for cities, or it's important for cities to be able to have those conversations at an earlier point so that they're able to understand and predict for and build timelines around and make their investments around the schedule of what's happening on their right-of-way.
Leah, I'm wondering if you could sort of build on that and think about, as you think about the trends that are on the horizon, like what are the top 3 investments your agency needs to think about making in order to promote the values of the city of Portland while also allowing the innovation to take hold and sort of drive, our economy, our built environment, and things of that nature?
I actually hold out hope that in some of our scenarios of nirvana, we're going to have to be making fewer investments in our transportation infrastructure, that we won't have to be doing thermoplastic pavement markings all over the place, that that these smart cars are going to be able to navigate our roadway system to a point where we can take some of the money in those investments and put them in like street preservation, maintenance, and other things. But a lot of the technology that's currently coming at us and needing use of our infrastructure is actually going to be costing us money. We have several companies that want to put sensors on our streetlight poles. Mm-hmm. Our streetlight poles aren't strong enough to hold them. We have to replace mast arms, all the the heavy infrastructure. So those aren't places where I want to invest money just to serve autonomous vehicles or to serve shared connected vehicles. So I want to go back to what Martha said. I think that where I think I'm going to have to spend money and where I want to spend money are kind of different, but really focusing on mobility solutions. And I like the idea that you were talking about grants for things. Right. And so that's a way to sort of dip your toe, or maybe a little bit more than the toe in the water, of getting into this framework and having them launch. I'm sorry I'm going to do this to you for a second, but something I wanted to go back to an earlier question. And the other thing that I really do want to talk about and have not found great thought leaders, or not thought leaders, but information in this space is insurance. Mm-hmm. We are going to have significant insurance ramifications, not only from TNCs. There's very different levels of insurance that are required of cabs and versus TNCs. And I think when we get into autonomous vehicles, who is going to be responsible for the passenger, the car, all those things are really still big question marks in my mind. So I think that's something where we're going to have to spend a significant level of time, energy, and investment in sussing that thing out while we're looking at framing the regulations for this.
Yeah. I'm going to come to questions in a little bit, but I want to just ask Martha and Molly a quick question. But, one of the things, speaking to that point about insurance and then also the different sort of levels in the regulatory framework. Something as simple as when an autonomous vehicle gets into a traffic accident with a self-driving car, who's at fault? Who pays? I mean, these are things that I think cities are going to need to grapple with at the most sort of mundane level too. Martha, Molly, is sort of, with your association hats on, I'm just wondering, what are the, sort of common or the most interesting sort of set of problems that you're hearing from your members as they sort of grapple with this transition?
I'll just joke for just a second. What I want Leah to spend her money on is I want her to do bike pullouts so that the Uber cars can pull over and I don't have to step behind them in the bike lane. I think the kinds of questions is how do you act pragmatically in the short term while you're trying to anticipate. And I will also say that I think we have an opportunity in local government to really shape whoever said it earlier about be intentional about the communities that we want to build and hold firm to the communities that we want to build, even in the face of the new technology coming online. And I think that the biggest conundrum for folks in city and county management is how do you actually do that, and what are the most important public policy issues for you to take on first as you do that. And then let me say last, the other thing that we all grapple with is we're dealing with real people right now who want to get where they're going right now. So we're dealing with these really big public policy conundrums of where we're headed at the same time as we're trying to deliver services in real time. And it's frankly, it's really quite challenging.
Molly?
Yeah, I'll just go to something off of what Leah said of what she wants to invest in. And we've been all promised this improved safety from autonomous vehicles. And I think something that NACTO cities really have been focusing on is no one's actually presented great evidence of that, right? They're not here. That doesn't necessarily exist yet, and it won't exist in the partially automated future either, which is what we're all looking at in the coming years. And so understanding how we can invest in our great streets as we've known them today and continue making our streets better for bicyclists and for pedestrians and for transit. And so that's kind of what we stay focused on, and the shiny kind of silver thing in the corner of your eye is the AVs. So.
Okay. I'm going to go to the audience.
Thank you. Hi, Matt Hoffman from Enterprise Community Partners. The transportation systems that you are all enabling have a tremendous effect on real estate valuation. I'm from the affordable housing sector. I'm wondering how, as we move forward, we're going to do a better job incorporating the secondary effects of transportation on things like affordable housing. How is that fitting into your work and your vision?
Let me just say that's something we're already trying to work on independent of the question of the technological change, because we've learned, I think, over the last 30 years in the Portland region that the effect of many of our major transportation investments, especially in transit systems, have had a pretty profound effect on real estate values and people's ability to live in the communities that we thought we were serving. We are still serving the physical place, but the people have had to move other places. And so we're trying to do real conscious work around displacement avoidance up front now in a way we've never done before. We're also looking at what are ways that we can actually have a good conversation with the rest of the residents of the region about our need as a region to make sure that everybody in the region has a safe place to live and an affordable place to live, because it's part of a healthy economy in our region. That if we don't do that, then we don't end up with the future that we have been so intentional about planning.
If I could just add to that, though, if we do deliver better transit, better biking, better walking, and if autonomous vehicles are going to be affordable, the cost of owning a car in the state of Oregon is over $9,000 a year. And that's not even the purchase price. So if we can reduce the burden of owning a vehicle, I think that does a lot to help people stay in place and help feed affordable housing. I mean, it's the second largest chunk of a household income gets spent on transportation.
We're number
I'm
one.
going to go over here.
So as a manager of a rural community, Martha, I'm really interested in your comments on acceleration of the divide, the urban-rural divide.
Yeah.
Your thoughts?
Well, I think that what you're seeing, and I think we're seeing it just right here in the Portland region, I don't think you have to actually get outside of the region, is deployment of Uber and Lyft has happened in the places where it's really easy for folks to get rides. And I think we're also seeing that around electrification. And so if you think about moving out to lower density parts of our state, and you think of yourself as rural, but I lived in Baker, and Independence ain't got nothing on Baker in terms of rural. The incentive for the private sector to go out in those places isn't very high because the density of consumers is just so darn low. So the amount of upfront investment they have to make to go there it's going to have to be subsidized, and it's probably going to have to be regulated.
Hi, my name's Andrea Broaddus. I've been kind of shy to speak up, but I'm going to out myself as someone who's here both as a planning academic and as I'm here consulting for Bosch, which is a supplier they're developing the autonomous vehicle and supplying all the companies, basically. So I just want to reiterate that, from the auto industry is kind of really watching this sector very closely, really looking to cities to signal about how they're going to shape future markets so that they can develop the technologies to comply, and that there are product timelines too. So that's sort of another time-sensitive dimension that if we're going to have something like VMT fees or curb access fees or occupancy monitoring, those signals need to be coming so that the technologies can find the support they need to be invested in the R&D. But my question for you guys is about security inside the future fleet of shared autonomous vehicles. Something that Bosch and others are thinking about is how are people going to be monitored inside? Is this something that you guys are thinking about? Violence, unwanted vandalism, basically anything that could happen on a bus but without the driver. How are you guys thinking about that?
I mean, I feel like I'm speaking too much, but I mean, it's absolutely something that we're thinking about, and from Portland's perspective, we saw this when we were doing regulations for Uber and Lyft, and there's a true concern. Not only are we going to have Wally World where people aren't going to, interact with each other anymore, but also the safety of passengers, especially if we start requiring shared rides, which is what we want to do because we want more people moving in the same space. So how we, solve that question is to be determined, but it's something that's definitely forefront in our council's mind for sure about what regulations would come forward.
We've been talking a lot about cybersecurity issues, because I don't know about any of you, but I've been to many discussions of this topic where someone immediately tells a story about having your car get hijacked while you're in it, which, if you think about it, isn't a really attractive thing. So I think that all those questions come up, and I'm not sure any one of us has the revealed truth on what the solutions are going to be.
Yeah, I'll give a different, it's not a hijacked car, but it's a hijacked signal network, and we've actually had cities that have come to us with that problem. And so what happens when you upgrade your technology, but you don't upgrade your workforce to support the technology in a strategic way? And I think even Alex was talking this morning about hiring a new data analyst, and that's something that's kind of newer for city governments, and so we also need to pay attention to the cybersecurity side as well.
I think that's also an opportunity for collaboration and partnership with the academia. We've got CERT, the National Cybersecurity Laboratory in Pittsburgh, and we have in the past kind of offered up opportunities for them to take a shot at our network and help expose vulnerabilities, and that's been incredibly valuable to us.
We have one more question.
Great, thank you. My name is Leanne Piper. I'm here from the city of Guelph, and I'll out myself as an elected official. I'm a city councillor in Ontario, Canada. And we haven't talked a lot about how AVs are going to be powered. And one of the things our municipality is looking at is actually building the charging station infrastructure. And we're in the process of an RFP to build 100 charging stations throughout our city. And I wondered whether you're talking about that power source and whether your energy grid is able to handle the new economy of a post-fossil fueled car world, and whether or not you're looking at it as a public infrastructure, or would that be more of a private infrastructure?
I have no idea if our grid's capable of handling it. I can't.
Assume not.
But the things that we're doing in terms of moving towards electrification is, we have charging stations, a density of them in the central city. We give away parking spaces for free for charging stations. But what we're also doing is building it into our development permitting. So new developments are required to have a certain number of stalls or locations for charging or charging infrastructure. And then we also give incentives for retrofitting as well to try to support.
I don't know. It's funny you asked that because I'm actually equally excited about the prospect of all those gas stations getting redeveloped. I'm actually kind of serious. I do know that electric cars take a tiny fraction of the energy it takes to power internal combustion engine. So even if our grid isn't ready yet, our global energy consumption will dramatically drop if we make this conversion. So
one of the challenges or ways that we've been approaching EV planning is to think about the way that EV usage is going to be changing, right? So it's not necessarily the existing pattern, which is the charging infrastructure in our parking structures downtown, where a vehicle's charging for 8 hours a day while somebody's in the office. Recognizing that particularly on-street infrastructure is going to be used in a very different way than your typical level 2 charger, means that you have to plan, and there's certain grid expectations associated with fast chargers as opposed to levels 2. Means that you kind of have to be a little bit more deliberate about future-proofing even the future infrastructure.
Molly, do you want to tackle that?
So at NACTO, we have had a lot of requests to look into this more from our cities. I will say that something we say a lot and hear a lot is VMT is still VMT, and that our members are working toward behavior change and more sustainable modes. And so electric vehicles will be great, but the congestion management side of me is still kind of grappling with what that means for our transportation networks.
So before we wrap up, here's the lightning round question. In 3 words or fewer, as the Sustainable Cities Initiative thinks about sort of planning its next conference, what's the thing that's missing on the agenda today that should be on it next time?
racial equity.
Future of work.
Accessibility.
Ditto, ditto, ditto.
Okay. Well, Nico, Becky, I think I've got your agenda for you. Thank you, panel.